The crisp morning air carried a sense of routine as officers gathered in the station parking lot, their voices blending into the hum of the city waking up. It was just another day, or so they thought. Among them was Officer Daniels, a man known for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue. He leaned against his patrol car, casually tossing jokes around with his colleagues, as if the world existed solely for their amusement. "Did you hear about the new recruit?" He chuckled, nudging his partner. "Word is, she's something else. Bet she won't last a week here." The others laughed along, the kind of laugh that carries an air of dismissal, a mockery of something, or someone, they hadn't even met yet. The target of their humor, it seemed, was a new addition to the team. All they knew was that she was a woman, a black woman, and that was enough to ignite their prejudices. Meanwhile, in the background, the hum of an engine grew louder as a sleek black car pulled into the lot. The laughter began to fade as the vehicle came to a smooth stop, and out stepped a woman unlike anyone they expected. Her tailored suit fit perfectly, exuding authority with every inch of fabric. Her posture was upright, confident, commanding. She took a moment to survey the group, her sharp eyes meeting theirs one by one, piercing through the veil of their assumptions. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that makes even the air around you feel heavy. Daniels, ever the joker, broke it with a smirk. Well, looks like we've got ourselves a VIP. What's the occasion, ma'am? Are you lost?" His tone dripped with sarcasm, and a few of the others snickered behind him. But she didn't flinch, she didn't even blink. Instead, she walked toward him with deliberate steps, her heels clicking against the pavement like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. The group exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of her silence. It wasn't anger that radiated from her, nor was it arrogance. It was something far more unsettling: control. Daniels tried again, this time louder, as if volume could mask the unease creeping into his voice. "I think you've got the wrong place, lady. This is a police station, not a—" "I know exactly where I am," she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration. The group straightened up instinctively, as if her words carried an unspoken command. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her presence sink in. And then she smiled, a subtle curve of her lips that was equal parts disarming and unnerving. "In fact," she continued, her gaze locking onto Daniels, "I'm exactly where I need to be." "Officer Daniels, isn't it?" His name on her lips seemed to catch him off guard. He stumbled for a response, his bravado slipping just slightly. "Oh yeah, that's right." "Well, Officer Daniels," she said, stepping closer until there was barely a foot of space between them, "you might want to rethink your first impressions. After all, you'll be reporting to me starting today." The air seemed to freeze. Time itself felt like it had come to a halt as her words sank in. Reporting to her. The officers stood in stunned silence, their earlier laughter now a distant memory. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed, as if he was searching for words that refused to come. She let the moment linger, her eyes scanning the group one final time before turning on her heel and walking toward the building. The sound of her heels echoed like a punctuation mark, leaving the officers rooted in place, questioning everything they thought they knew. The story was only just beginning, but one thing was clear: the balance of power had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. Inside the station, the air was thick with murmurs and sideways glances. Officers whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of confusion, disbelief, and a hint of embarrassment. They had all been so sure of their place, so comfortable in their hierarchy, and now this woman, a stranger, had turned everything upside down within moments of arriving. Daniels stood near his desk, his mind still replaying her words over and over again. "You'll be reporting to me starting today." It didn't make sense. How could someone they hadn't even heard of suddenly be in charge? And why hadn't they been informed? Usually, news like this would travel through the department like wildfire. He glanced toward the door to the chief's office, which was now closed. She had gone in there moments after walking past them, her calm, confident demeanor unwavering. Daniels couldn't help but wonder what was being discussed on the other side of that door. Was this some kind of test? A joke? He looked around at the other officers, hoping for some reassurance, but they all seemed just as lost as he was. "Who is she?" One of the younger officers, Ramirez, finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Beats me," Daniels muttered, though his tone carried more frustration than confusion. He hated not knowing things, hated being caught off guard. It made him feel vulnerable, and vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford in this job. "She must be someone important," another officer chimed in, her eyes darting toward the chief's office. "I mean, did you see how she walked in here? Like she owned the place." Daniels let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, confidence doesn't mean she's qualified. Let's see how long she lasts when she actually has to deal with the job." But even as he said it, a part of him wondered if he was wrong. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just the way she carried herself or the way she had looked him directly in the eye without flinching. It was the way she seemed completely unfazed by their reactions, as if she had been expecting it all along. In the chief's office, the woman sat across from the desk, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Chief Harris, an older man with years of experience etched into his face, regarded her carefully. He had been the one to make the call, the one to bring her here, but even he was unsure of how the rest of the department would take it. "I take it your introduction didn't go as smoothly as we hoped," he said, leaning back in his chair. She smiled faintly, her calm demeanor never wavering. "I wasn't expecting a warm welcome." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't going to be easy for you. They're a tight-knit group, and some of them, well, let's just say they don't take kindly to change." "I'm not here to make friends," she replied, her tone even. "I'm here to do my job." "And you're sure you're ready for this?" he asked, studying her closely. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I've been ready for a long time, Chief." Harris held her gaze for a moment before nodding. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "All right then, let's get to work." Meanwhile, in the break room, the tension among the officers was palpable. The usual banter and laughter were replaced by quiet conversations and furtive glances toward the hallway. Daniels stood near the coffee machine, his arms crossed as he listened to the others speculate about the new arrival. "I bet she's some kind of diversity hire," one officer said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You know how they are these days, always trying to check boxes." Daniels frowned but said nothing. He didn't like the direction the conversation was heading, but he wasn't sure how to steer it back. Besides, a part of him was still grappling with his own feelings about the situation. "Or maybe she's here to clean house," another officer suggested, his tone conspiratorial. "You know, get rid of the dead weight." That comment drew a few uneasy chuckles, but Daniels remained silent. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were all missing something, that there was more to this woman than they realized. As the day went on, the mystery only deepened. The new boss, whose name they eventually learned was Nia Carter, spent most of the morning in meetings with the chief and other higher-ups. She barely interacted with the rest of the department, leaving them to stew in their curiosity and frustration. By lunchtime, the tension had reached a boiling point. Daniels found himself pacing the hallway, unable to focus on anything else. He hated feeling this way, hated the uncertainty that hung over the station like a storm cloud. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. With a deep breath, he approached the chief's office and knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened, and there she was, standing in front of him. "Officer Daniels," she said, her tone neutral. "Can I help you?" He hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the directness of her gaze. But then he squared his shoulders, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I just wanted to introduce myself properly," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Her expression softened slightly, and she extended a hand. "Mia Carter," she said simply. He shook her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Welcome to the department," he said, though the words felt strange coming out of his mouth. "Thank you," she replied. "I hope we can work together to make this a better place for everyone." Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight that Daniels couldn't quite decipher. He nodded, not trusting himself to say anything more, and stepped back as she walked past him. As she disappeared down the hallway, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There was something about her, something that didn't fit neatly into the boxes they were so used to. And whether they liked it or not, things were about to change. In the days that followed, Mia Carter's presence continued to stir the waters. She didn't demand respect, but she earned it in quiet, deliberate ways, through her actions, her decisions, and her unwavering commitment to justice. But not everyone was ready to embrace the change she represented. Whispers of dissent began to grow louder, and tensions simmered just beneath the surface. Daniels found himself caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to his colleagues and a growing respect for the woman who had turned their world upside down. And as the days turned into weeks, he began to realize that this wasn't just about her, it was about all of them. Change had come to the station, and there was no going back. Over the next week, the station buzzed with unease. Mia Carter worked steadily, her presence undeniable. She didn't throw her weight around, nor did she make grand speeches or sweeping changes right away. Instead, she observed, took notes, and quietly began to familiarize herself with the department's operations. Her calm, composed demeanor was unsettling to some, especially officers like Daniels, who found themselves unsure of how to read her. Daniels had spent years mastering the unspoken rules of the station. He knew how to navigate its politics, how to earn the trust of his colleagues, and how to command respect in his own way. But now, with Mia Carter at the helm, everything felt off balance. He couldn't tell if she was watching him or simply taking stock of the station as a whole. That uncertainty gnawed at him, leaving him on edge. One morning, Daniels found himself in the break room, sipping coffee as he tried to shake off his frustration. Ramirez entered, his expression unusually tense. "You hear about the meeting she's calling this afternoon?" Ramirez asked, grabbing a cup. Daniels frowned. "What meeting?" "Mandatory," Ramirez said, pouring his coffee. "Whole department. She's supposed to be laying out her vision or something." Daniels felt a flicker of annoyance. "Her vision," he muttered, taking another sip. "Guess we'll see what that looks like." The meeting room was packed later that afternoon, the air thick with tension. Mia stood at the front, her posture as steady and unshakable as ever. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "I know change can be difficult," she started, her voice calm but firm. "And I know my presence here has caused some discomfort. That's natural. But I didn't come here to disrupt for the sake of disruption. I came here because this department has the potential to be better, stronger, more effective, and more connected to the community we serve." Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others folded their arms, their skepticism clear. Daniel sat near the back, his arms crossed, watching her closely. "I'm not here to criticize the work you've done," she continued. "I'm here to build on it. To make sure that when we put on this uniform, we're not just enforcing the law, but setting an example. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, both for our sake and for the people who depend on us." The room remained quiet, though Daniels noticed a few heads nodding here and there. Mia paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "There will be changes," she said, her tone unyielding. "Not for the sake of appearances, but because they're necessary. And I want to be clear, I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for effort, for accountability, and for a willingness to grow." She ended the meeting shortly after, leaving the room to a mix of reactions. Some officers seemed thoughtful, while others walked out with muttered complaints. Daniels stayed behind, lingering near the back as he tried to process her words. "Still think she's just here to shake things up?" Ramirez asked, joining him. Daniels shook his head slowly. "I don't know what to think." But beneath his uncertainty was a growing sense of curiosity. He didn't want to admit it, Not to himself and certainly not to anyone else. But something about Mia's words had struck a chord. He didn't like the way she had upended the status quo, but he couldn't deny that she made him think. In the following days, the station began to feel like a battleground, not in an overt way, but in the subtle shifts of power and influence. Some officers rallied behind Mia, impressed by her vision and leadership. Others dug in their heels, refusing to accept her authority or the changes she proposed. Daniels found himself caught in the middle. He wasn't ready to throw his support behind her, but he couldn't bring himself to join the quiet rebellion forming among a handful of his colleagues. Instead, he watched and waited, trying to make sense of the undercurrents swirling around him. One afternoon, as Daniels was filing paperwork, he overheard a heated conversation in the hallway. He recognized the voices immediately, Officers Johnson and Pierce, two of the station's most vocal critics of Mia's leadership. "She doesn't belong here," Johnson was saying, his voice low but angry. "She doesn't understand how we operate." "And she never will," Pierce added. "She's trying to fix something that wasn't broken." Daniels stepped into the hallway, his presence cutting their conversation short. The two officers glanced at him, their expressions guarded. "Something on your mind?" Daniels asked, his tone neutral. Johnson shrugged, his jaw tight. "Just saying what we're all thinking." "Not all of us," Daniels said evenly, though he wasn't entirely sure where his words were coming from. Part of him wanted to challenge them, but another part wanted to stay out of it altogether. Johnson smirked. "Come on, Daniels. You've been here long enough to know how this place works. You really think she's going to change that?" Daniels didn't respond, and the two officers eventually walked away, the conversation picking up again as soon as they turned the corner. The encounter left Daniels feeling uneasy. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, their resistance to Mia's leadership or his own inability to take a clear stance. He hated feeling stuck, trapped between two worlds that seemed increasingly at odds with each other. That evening, as Daniels was leaving the station, he saw Mia in the parking lot. She was standing by her car, looking out at the city with an expression he couldn't quite read. For a moment, he considered walking away, but something compelled him to approach her. "Long day?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. She turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "They all are," she said with a faint smile. Daniels hesitated, unsure of what to say. "You know," he began, "not everyone here is on board with what you're trying to do." "I know," she said simply. "And you're okay with that?" he asked, genuinely curious. She met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, "and it doesn't happen without resistance. I didn't take this job because I thought it would be easy. I took it because I knew it would be worth it." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Daniels felt a flicker of understanding. He still wasn't sure where he stood, but he couldn't deny that she believed in what she was doing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to make him start questioning his own doubts. As he walked to his car, the tension within him remained, but it felt different somehow, less like a burden and more like a challenge. He didn't know what the future held for Mia Carter or the station as a whole, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all standing on the edge of something big, something that would change everything. The station was a pressure cooker, and the heat was turning up by the day. Conversations that once happened in whispers now spilled out into louder, more obvious exchanges. The divide between those who supported Mia Carter and those who stood firmly against her was no longer subtle, it was stark, with tensions simmering close to the surface. Daniels could feel it every time he walked into a room. The energy was heavier, the air thicker. Even the daily routines, the patrol schedules, and the paperwork felt loaded with something unspoken but impossible to ignore. He had always taken pride in his ability to navigate conflict, to keep his head down and get the job done. But this was different. This wasn't just tension between officers. It felt bigger, like something was about to boil over. Late one evening, Daniels found himself staying after hours, the station nearly empty. He sat at his desk, staring at a report he'd been working on but unable to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the moments that had led them here, the meetings, the heated exchanges, the quiet confrontations in hallways and break rooms. The turning point had come earlier that day, during a department-wide review Mia had initiated. It was meant to be a routine evaluation, but it quickly became anything but. As Mia outlined her findings, areas where the station excelled and others where improvement was needed, Pierce, one of the loudest voices of dissent, had interrupted her. "So, what's the plan?" he'd asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Are you going to tell us everything we're doing wrong and expect us to thank you for it?" The room had gone silent, every pair of eyes darting between Pierce and Mia. She had paused, her gaze steady as she looked at him. "No," she had replied calmly. "I'm going to work with you to fix it, but that only works if you're willing to meet me halfway." Pierce had scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You've got a lot of nerve, coming in here and acting like you know what this department needs. You haven't been here long enough to understand how we operate." Mia didn't flinch. "You're right, I haven't been here long, but I've been in law enforcement long enough to know that when a team isn't working together, it's the community that suffers, and that's not something I'm willing to accept." The tension in the room had been palpable, the silence stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Chief Harris had stepped in, redirecting the conversation and bringing the review to a close. But the damage was done. The divide had deepened, and the atmosphere in the station had grown even more charged. Now, sitting at his desk, Daniels replayed the scene in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Mia had handled herself, not with anger or defensiveness, but with a quiet strength that was impossible to ignore. For the first time, he found himself wondering what it would take to bring the department together. Could it even be done? Or was the gap between them too wide to bridge? A noise pulled him from his thoughts, the sound of voices echoing down the hallway. Curious, he got up and followed the sound, his footsteps quiet on the tiled floor. As he approached the break room, he realized the voices belonged to Johnson and Pierce. They were speaking in low tones, their words sharp and laced with frustration. "She's trying to make us look incompetent," Johnson was saying. "Like we don't know how to do our jobs." Pierce nodded, his jaw tight. "She's just waiting for us to mess up so she can justify whatever changes she wants to make." Daniels stepped into the doorway, making his presence known. The two men fell silent, their expressions hardening as they turned to face him. "Still talking about her?" Daniels asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. Johnson crossed his arms. "You got something to add?" Daniels shrugged. "Just wondering how long you're planning to fight this. She's not going anywhere, you know." Pierce narrowed his eyes. "And you're okay with that?" "I don't know," Daniels admitted, "but I do know that sitting around complaining isn't going to change anything." The tension between them was thick, but Daniels held his ground. Finally, Johnson shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he pushed past Daniels and left the room. Pierce lingered for a moment before following, his expression unreadable. Daniels let out a slow breath, his mind racing. The cracks in the department were growing wider, and he wasn't sure how much longer they could hold together before something gave way. He thought about Mia, about the weight she was carrying and the resistance she faced at every turn. He didn't envy her position, but he couldn't deny the respect he was starting to feel for her. The next morning, the tension reached a boiling point. Mia had called another meeting, this time to address some of the concerns that had been raised during the review. The room was full, but the mood was anything but cooperative. As Mia spoke, outlining her plans for the department, the murmurs and whispers began to grow louder. Finally, Pierce stood up, his voice cutting through the noise. "With all due respect, how do we know any of this is going to work? How do we know you're not just setting us up to fail?" Mia met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Because failure isn't an option," she said. "Not for me, and not for this department. We owe it to the people we serve, and to ourselves, to do better. And that starts with all of us working together." Pierce shook his head, his frustration evident. "That's easy for you to say. You haven't been here long enough to understand what we're up against. You're right, Mia said, surprising the room. I haven't been here long, but I've been where you are, facing challenges, dealing with resistance, and trying to make sense of it all. I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I'm here to help, not to tear anyone down. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a blanket. Daniels watched her closely, his mind racing. He could see the cracks in the department growing wider, the tension nearing its breaking point. Something was about to give, he could feel it, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the room was heavy as Mia's words hung in the air. She stood there, unwavering, her steady gaze challenging anyone who dared to meet it. The tension was almost unbearable, and yet no one spoke. Daniels could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on the room, the fragile balance teetering on the edge of collapse. But just as the meeting seemed to reach its natural conclusion, the door burst open, and Chief Harris walked in, his face unusually grave. All eyes turned to him, the air shifting immediately. Harris was rarely one to interrupt, and his presence sent a ripple of unease through the room. He stepped to the front, standing beside Mia, his expression giving away nothing but a deep seriousness. We've just received some troubling information, Harris began, his voice firm but low. There's an investigation being launched into this department, allegations of misconduct spanning the past 2 years. The room erupted into murmurs, the officers exchanging uneasy glances. Mia's expression didn't change, but Daniels noticed the faintest flicker of something, concern, maybe, or frustration, cross her face. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her as Harris continued. This investigation is external, Harris went on. They'll be looking at everything, every case, every arrest, every report. Nothing is off limits. I expect full cooperation from every one of you. Daniels felt his stomach sink. An external investigation was no small thing. It meant that every decision, every action, every mistake would be under scrutiny. The tension that had been simmering within the department now threatened to boil over completely. And yet, as Daniels glanced around the room, he couldn't help but notice the mix of reactions. Some officers looked genuinely worried, their faces pale and drawn. Others, like Johnson and Pierce, looked angry, their expressions hardened with defiance. What kind of allegations? Pierce asked, his voice sharp. Harris's gaze landed on him, steady and unflinching. Discrimination, misuse of authority, excessive force. The words landed like a hammer, the weight of them settling over the room. Daniels felt his chest tighten, the implications of the investigation hitting him all at once. This wasn't just about individual actions, it was about the culture of the department as a whole. And suddenly, everything Mia had been trying to do, the changes, the accountability, the push for higher standards, seemed even more urgent. Pierce scoffed, shaking his head. So this is it then? They're going to come in here and treat us like criminals? No, Mia said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. They're going to hold us accountable. And if there's nothing to hide, we have nothing to fear. Pierce turned to her, his anger evident. Easy for you to say. You're the one trying to change everything. For all we know, you're the reason this is happening. Daniels watched Mia closely, waiting to see how she would respond. She didn't flinch or waver, her gaze steady as she looked at Pierce. This investigation isn't about me, she said evenly. It's about us. All of us. And if there are issues in this department, it's our responsibility to address them, not to deny them or deflect blame. Pierce muttered something under his breath and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the silence, and for a moment no one moved. Harris looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each officer. We've been given an opportunity, Harris said finally, his voice firm but calm. To prove who we are and what we stand for. Let's not waste it. The meeting ended shortly after, the officers filing out one by one, their expressions ranging from anxious to defiant. Daniels stayed behind, lingering near the back as he tried to process everything. He could feel the shift in the air, the sense that things were moving towards something bigger, something unavoidable. Mia stood at the front of the room, speaking quietly with Harris. Daniels watched them for a moment, his mind racing. He couldn't help but wonder how much Mia had known, whether she had anticipated this investigation, or if it had blindsided her as much as it had the rest of them. Either way, she didn't seem shaken. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever. As Daniels walked out of the room, he overheard snippets of conversation among his colleagues. Some were worried about what the investigation might uncover. Others were angry, blaming Mia for the scrutiny they were now under. But as Daniels listened, he realized something important. The lines in the sand were becoming clearer. The divide in the department wasn't just about Mia's leadership anymore. It was about what kind of department they wanted to be. That night, Daniels found himself unable to sleep. He kept replaying the day's events in his mind, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. He thought about Mia, about her calm but unyielding determination. He thought about Pierce and Johnson, about their resistance and their fear. And he thought about himself, caught in the middle, trying to make sense of it all. But as the hours ticked by, a new thought began to take shape. What if this investigation wasn't just a challenge, it was an opportunity? An opportunity to confront the problems that had been festering beneath the surface, to rebuild the department into something stronger, something better. The idea was both daunting and exhilarating, and for the first time, Daniels felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, as he walked into the station, Daniels noticed something different. The usual buzz of conversation was quieter, the atmosphere heavier. The weight of the investigation hung over everyone, its presence impossible to ignore. But amid the tension, Daniels noticed something else, a sense of resolve, faint but growing. Mia was already in her office, the door slightly ajar. Daniels hesitated for a moment before knocking lightly and stepping inside. She looked up, her expression neutral but attentive. "Got a minute?" he asked. She nodded, gesturing for him to sit. As he took a seat, Daniels felt a surge of nerves, but he pushed through it. "I just wanted to say, I get it," he said, his voice steady. "What you're trying to do here. I'm not saying I agree with everything, but I see what you're fighting for, and I think it's worth it." Mia studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start, and as Daniels left her office, he couldn't help but feel that the tide was beginning to turn. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The fight for the department's future was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The station was quiet in the days following the announcement of the investigation, but it was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, almost ominous. Officers kept their heads down, doing their work while watching their backs. There were whispered conversations in corners, nervous glances exchanged in hallways, and a sense that everyone was bracing for something to break. For Mia, the pressure was palpable. Every decision she made seemed to carry the weight of the entire department's future. And yet, she stayed composed, her focus unwavering. The investigation team arrived on a stormy Monday morning. A group of stern-faced individuals in suits, carrying briefcases and laptops, swept into the station like a wave. They were thorough, asking questions, pulling files, and sitting down with officers one by one. It didn't take long for the atmosphere to shift from tense to suffocating. Officers who had previously dismissed the situation as nothing more than a formality were now sweating bullets, their confidence unraveling as the scrutiny grew more intense. Daniels had been called in for questioning late in the afternoon. The room was stark and cold, the investigator's piercing gaze making it hard to hold eye contact. They went over his reports, his conduct, his choices on the job. It wasn't accusatory, but it was probing, and Daniels felt exposed in a way he never had before. When it was over, he walked out of the room with a mix of relief and anxiety. It wasn't just about him. It was about the department as a whole, and something told him this was only the beginning. The real turning point came 2 days later. Mia had called a mandatory meeting in the briefing room, her tone sharp but measured. Everyone filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. Daniel sat near the back, his arms crossed, watching as Mia stood at the front with a folder in her hand. "I've been working closely with the investigation team," she began, her voice steady but serious. "And there are some things you all need to know." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Mia opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers, her expression unreadable. "Over the past 2 years, there have been multiple instances of misconduct within this department," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Some of them are minor, the result of poor judgment or lack of training. Others are more serious, actions that not only violate protocol but undermine the trust between this department and the community we serve." Murmurs rippled through the room, officers exchanging uneasy glances. Mia held up a hand, silencing them. "I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame," she continued. "I'm here to fix this, to make this department stronger, better. But that can only happen if we're willing to face the truth." Daniels felt his chest tighten as he watched her. This was it, the moment of reckoning they had all been dreading. And yet, there was something in Mia's voice, in the way she carried herself, that made him believe it wasn't too late, that they could still turn things around. But then, just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, the door to the briefing room burst open. Pierce stormed in, his face red with anger, a stack of papers clutched in his hand. "This is a joke," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "You think you can come in here, tear us apart, and then expect us to just fall in line?" Mia turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "This isn't about tearing anyone apart," she said. "It's about accountability." "Accountability?" Pierce scoffed, throwing the papers onto the table. "You've been digging through our files, looking for anything you can use against us. And for what? To make yourself look good." Mia didn't flinch. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about this department and the people we serve. If there's a problem, we need to address it. Ignoring it won't make it go away." Pierce shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You don't get it, do you? You're not one of us. You never will be." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Daniels glanced around the room, noticing the way some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others nodded in agreement. The divide was clearer than ever, the tension nearing its breaking point. But then something unexpected happened. Johnson, who had been one of Pierce's closest allies, stood up. He looked around the room, his expression conflicted, before finally turning to Mia. "I don't agree with everything you've done," he said slowly, his voice steady but hesitant. "But I can't deny that things need to change. And if you're willing to fight for this department, then maybe we should too." The room fell silent, the weight of Johnson's words sinking in. Pierce looked at him in disbelief, his face a mixture of anger and betrayal. "You're kidding me," Pierce said, his voice low and dangerous. Johnson shrugged. "Maybe it's time we stopped fighting each other and started fighting for something better." Mia didn't say anything, but Daniels could see the faintest hint of relief in her expression. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as Daniels looked around the room, he could see the shift in the air. The divide wasn't gone, but it was starting to close. Slowly, tentatively, officers began to nod, their expressions softening. But just as it seemed the tension might finally break, the investigator walked into the room, his expression grim. He handed Mia a piece of paper, whispering something in her ear before stepping back. Mia read the paper, her face darkening. "What is it?" Daniels asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Mia looked up, her gaze sweeping the room. "We've uncovered evidence of tampered reports," she said, her voice low but firm. "Someone's been covering up misconduct." The room erupted into chaos, officers shouting over each other as the reality of her words sank in. Daniels felt his stomach drop, the stakes rising higher than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about accountability or trust. This was about betrayal from within. And as the shouting grew louder, Daniels realized one thing: the fight for the department's future was far from over, and the real battle was only just beginning. The room was in complete disarray as the revelation of tampered reports sent shockwaves through the station. Accusations flew, tension boiled over, and the divide among the officers grew deeper with every passing second. Mia stood at the front of the room, letting the chaos run its course for a moment. Her face was calm but determined, a sharp contrast to the emotional storm brewing around her. Finally, she raised her hand, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Enough," she said, her tone sharp and commanding. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. "This is not the time for finger-pointing. We're going to get to the bottom of this, but we do it the right way, with facts, not assumptions." Her words had an immediate effect. While the room remained tense, the shouting stopped, and a reluctant sense of order began to take hold. Mia looked at the investigator standing near the doorway and gave a subtle nod. He stepped forward, holding up the tampered reports. "These documents show clear evidence of alterations," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We will be conducting interviews and gathering further evidence to identify who's responsible. But rest assured, the truth will come out." The announcement cast a heavy shadow over the room. Everyone knew that the station's reputation, already fragile, now hung by a thread. Yet, as the officers sat in uneasy silence, there was also a growing sense of resolve. This was their moment to prove they were capable of change, that they could rise above the mistakes of the past and build something stronger. Over the next few weeks, the investigation intensified. Officers who had been involved in questionable incidents were called in for questioning, their actions scrutinized under a microscope. For some, it was a sobering wake-up call. For others, it was the end of the road. One by one, the individuals responsible for the tampered reports were identified and removed from their positions. Among them was Pierce, whose arrogance and defiance had finally caught up with him. When he was escorted out of the station for the last time, there was no applause, no celebration, just a quiet understanding that justice had been served. But accountability was only the first step. Mia knew that real change required more than just weeding out the bad actors. It meant rebuilding trust, both within the department and with the community. She implemented a series of reforms, including mandatory ethics training, increased transparency in reporting, and a community outreach program designed to bridge the gap between officers and the people they served. These changes weren't easy, and there was plenty of resistance along the way. But little by little, progress was made. Daniels found himself at the center of this transformation. At first, he was skeptical of Mia's vision, unsure if it was even possible to change the deeply ingrained culture of the department. But as he watched her navigate one challenge after another with grace and determination, his doubts began to fade. He started attending the community outreach events, meeting with residents, and listening to their concerns. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. And for the first time in a long time, Daniels felt a sense of purpose in his work. One afternoon, during a particularly heated community meeting, an elderly woman stood up and shared her story. She spoke about how she had grown up in the neighborhood, how she had seen the good and bad of law enforcement over the years, and how she had almost given up hope that things would ever get better. But then she looked directly at Mia and smiled. "I see something different in you," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You're not just talking about change, you're making it happen. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can trust you." Her words hit the room like a wave, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the audience began to clap. Mia didn't respond with a speech or grand gesture. She simply nodded, her expression one of quiet gratitude. Back at the station, the mood had started to shift. Officers who had once viewed Mia with suspicion were now coming to her for guidance and support. Even Johnson, who had initially wavered in his loyalty to Pierce, had become one of her staunchest allies. He often joked that Mia had a way of turning skeptics into believers, and while it was said with a smile, there was truth in his words. Daniels, too, found himself transformed. He began to see Mia not just as a leader, but as someone who genuinely cared about the people around her. He admired her ability to stay calm under pressure, her willingness to make tough decisions, and her unwavering commitment to doing what was right. It wasn't long before he found himself standing by her side, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Months passed, and the department slowly began to rebuild its reputation. The changes Mia had implemented were starting to take root, and while there was still plenty of work to be done, the progress was undeniable. Community members who had once avoided the station were now coming in to talk with officers, share their concerns, and even volunteer to help with outreach programs. Trust was being restored, one step at a time. One evening, after a long day of meetings and paperwork, Mia stood in her office, looking out the window at the city below. The lights of the streets stretched out before her, a reminder of the community she had sworn to serve. Daniels knocked on the door, stepping inside with a hesitant smile. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Always," Maya replied, gesturing for him to sit. Daniels hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say, you've done something incredible here. I don't think anyone else could have pulled this off." Mia smiled, her expression softening. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was all of us. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because people decide to come together and make it happen." Daniels nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Still, you were the spark, and I think I speak for everyone when I say we're lucky to have you." Mia didn't respond right away, her gaze drifting back to the city. Finally, she turned to Daniels, her expression thoughtful. "We're all in this together," she said, "and as long as we remember that, I think we'll be okay." It wasn't a dramatic ending or a grand declaration, but it was enough. The department still faced challenges, but they were moving in the right direction, and for Mia, Daniels, and the rest of the team, that was what mattered most. Together, they had taken the first steps toward a better future, and while the road ahead was uncertain, they were ready to face it head-on.